For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Mudley. Joining me today is journalist and author Gavin Evans, here to discuss his latest book, White Supremacy, A Brief History of Hatred. In White Supremacy, you analyze the historical roots and development of white supremacy. Can you explain how the concept of whiteness was constructed and how it's been used to justify hierarchies throughout history?
Look, I think the origin of people being conscious of whiteness, I think, is quite opaque. And it might go all the way back 5,000 years ago when there was this wave of people from the Russian steppe, or kind of the current Ukrainian era, who populated the whole of mainly Northern Europe, but also parts of India. And they were light-skinned people, and the indigenous people were more dark-skinned. So I think that's where whiteness might have come from, and there might well have been clashes there because the invaders were lighter skinned than the people who were being invaded. But we really don't know, because that was before there was writing, so there's no record of that. But I think if we're looking at a concept of white superiority, of course we can look at slavery and colonialism, which go back thousands of years, because always when a dominant group takes over another population and makes it subservient, they assume that they are superior and justify what they do on the basis of their perceived superiority. What I've focused on more in the book is the concept of whiteness that emerged with the idea that white people were innately more intelligent than black people. Now, that might have been implicit in the colonial and slave experience, but it became explicit right about the middle of the 19th century, where you started to get what we now call race science or scientific racism or faux scientific racism emerging, initially through the idea of measuring people's heads and filling it up with buckshot or birdshot, and phrenology, which is the idea of different shapes of head had belonged to different races and reflected different abilities. And that kind of idea started to emerge. And you started to see people adopting these ideas within the scientific community. I mean, none more so than Charles Darwin, who, when he wrote The Voyage of the Beagle, had some enlightened ideas. He was anti-slavery. He supported the trial of the governor of Jamaica because of the massacre he carried out against people there. There was ambiguity, I must say, there about his attitudes to some of the hunter-gatherer people he came across. But by the time you get to Descent of Man, which is his last great book, so we're moving 30 years on, he was virulently racist, comparing African people to gorillas. And he just saw no future for them. So his cousin, Francis Galton, who was even more rabidly racist, he believed that something needed to be done about this. Darwin also did, but Galton was particularly insistent. And he came up with the idea of what he called eugenics, which is the idea of improving a population. And he advocated, on the one hand, that wealthier people, white people, should breed more. He assumed wealthier people were innately more intelligent. So that was called positive eugenics. And then negative eugenics, those he regarded as imbeciles, should be sterilized, and inferior races should be, as he put it, gradually exterminated. And that idea spread very, very rapidly throughout Europe to the United States and other places as well, like Japan. So that idea of eugenics, which was tied up with race and tied up with whiteness, became ubiquitous by the time we get to the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century.
Now, your book does highlight the ways white supremacy has evolved and adapted over time. How do contemporary manifestations of white supremacy differ from those of slavery and colonial eras?
I'm more interested in the parallels. I've never believed that history repeats itself, but some ideas seem to linger in society. And one of those is an idea that has emerged in capital letter form over the last 15 years, and it's called the Great Replacement. And the Great Replacement is the idea, which is very similar to what Galton and others were saying, the early eugenicists were saying, often almost word for word, that the white populations of Europe and America are being conspiratorially replaced by, in Europe, Muslim populations, and in America, by Hispanic and Black people. I mean, in reality, the indigenous population of America, the Native Americans, not the white people, but as I'm just talking about as they see it. So this idea is very similar to the eugenics idea. It's a form of eugenics, because what they're proposing is very similar. Like the early eugenicists in the United States ensured that laws were passed to keep out migration from people from Southern Europe and also from Asia and Africa, so that only Nordic, as they call it, Nordic immigrants could come in numbers. Now, something similar is happening now with Trump really cutting back on immigration, but encouraging white South African farmers to migrate. It's exactly the same. They also, there've been attempts in the United States, Elon Musk is part of this kind of call to boost the birth rate among people who regard themselves as intelligent. So very similar kinds of ideas are coming out. Keep the hordes out because they're going to dilute the population, boost the birth rate of white people, really. And the one thing that no longer applies is mass sterilization campaigns, which is what happened in all the countries that introduced eugenics. In Britain, it was blocked by liberals in parliament, but in the United States and many European countries, there were mass sterilizations of people who were deemed to be below par intellectually.
And can you talk about the influence of great replacement ideas on young men with access to weapons?
So there's something very interesting happening, and I've been seeing it in real time while I was researching this book. In fact, one of the things that got me started with this book was when I read about the Peyton Gendron mass murder of Black people in a shopping center in New York 2 years ago. I started seeing reports of his manifesto, and I went to a group in Britain called Hope Not Hate, anti-fascist group, and his manifesto had been taken off the ClearNet. So I got them to send me a copy, and I read through this very carefully, this verbose document, and it was full of references to race science, people I'd been focusing on actually in a previous book, and some of them were quite mainstream. And this is what kind of got him stood up. But the other thing I noticed was he said, I should have got outsmarted, spent all my life on 4chan. I then started looking at some of the other manifestos, because he referenced a guy called Brenton Tarrant, who had murdered large numbers of Muslim people in Christchurch in New Zealand. So I looked at his manifesto and so on. So I looked at a whole range of people, Dylan Roof and others, and they were all on 4chan. So they all had come from this online message board site. And so I started looking at that, and I went into 4chan. I used to go in for an hour a day, about as much as I could take, on their poll tab, which is the worst part of it. The level of racism was vile, but the other thing that was there was extreme misogyny, rape fantasies, things like that. And the two went together. There wasn't any separation between them. The same posters who were posting about how white people were superior to Black and brown people were also posting all these kind of rape fantasy stuff. And it was clear that these were young men. The kind of language they used, and Peppy the Frog was their kind of symbol. They talked about keck, which was fun. They talked about triggering the libtards, the retarded liberals, and so on. They were red-pilled because they had the knowledge about race stuff. It was the language of young men. I then started doing more research on it. Now, what I found, I mean, there's nothing new about this, is that the algorithms were driving in social media more generally, not just on extremist sites like 4chan, that were driving young men and young women, particularly Gen Z, in different directions. And you can see this played out in the elections. Young women tended not to vote for Trump. Young men tended to vote for Trump, even more so in the German election, where large numbers of young men voted for the fascist AfD, and not very many women did. And large numbers of young women voted for the Left Party. So there's this huge gap, bigger than ever before, in gender-based politics. So the kinds of people who attracted young men, 18-year-old kind of types. But Peyton Gendron was 19, but when he was on these sites, he's from the age of about 16. They might go in because they feel like they're not getting their due. The jobs that were there for their fathers are not there for them. They're not doing as well as their sisters in school. They're not getting into university. But these people like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson tell them that they must, eat lots of meat, get big muscles, and stand up for themselves. And the kind of misogyny of someone like Andrew Tate attracts them to those sites, and that's where they find the race science stuff. The one thing leads to another.
And so, do you think that the media perpetuates these white supremacist ideas?
I think it's not as direct as that. I think that what it is that they set their algorithms to get as many eyes as possible on their site because that increases their advertising, etc., etc., etc. So it could be as simple as something like if a girl gets some bad comments on a picture that she puts up on Insta and then she takes it off, that girl, the chances are, will be bombarded with dieting ads and things like that. So that's how it works. Now, men who show an interest in having big muscles, they're going to go down one path.
Now, Gavin, can you talk to us about the connection between white supremacy and economic systems? How do capitalist structures support and sustain white supremacy both historically and today?
Well, historically, if one looks at the history of capitalism, one sees that the capital of a lot of countries, including Britain, where I live, came from not out of the air, not just out of the labor of people in Britain, though certainly that was part of it, but also from colonialism. And colonialism from Britain included slavery because the entire West Indies were slave colonies. So the slavery and colonialism gave the capital and even the raw materials that drove the British economy in the United States. The way that it developed was simply through internal conquest. So from a small group, it spread, taking Native American land, taking Mexican land, taking the whole of Hawaii, just seizing land all over the place. And that gave the scale that allowed the American economy to grow. So I think that one cannot separate capitalism, if we look at it historically, from the kind of belief that you run other people's lives better than they can run them themselves, and slavery, that you can own another person's life. I don't think capitalism can be separated from that. I mean, if we look at it today, I can look at it in a different sense, in that the current phase of capitalism is and the future is going to be driven by things like AI. It's driven by what is happening in terms of social media and so on. I mean, these are the driving forces that information technology is driving it. And that information technology is what's also driving people down these rabbit holes. So, I don't think you can ever separate the economic system from its various results. I'm not saying that the one inevitably leads to the other. It's that if one traces back, one can see a clear link, though.
And lastly, Gavin, what role do grassroots activism and policy change play in addressing deep-rooted white supremacy?
I think there's two things I would say there. The one thing is what we were talking about earlier, which is these young white men going in dangerous directions. And so part of the activism needs to be to confront that. Now, in no way should that be to hold women back, but there needs to be a focus on, okay, well, how do we prevent these young men going in that direction? So I think schools can play a role there in talking about race science and why it's wrong, in talking about misogyny and why it's wrong, in talking about extreme pornography and why it's wrong. I think those three are all kind of linked together. Also, parents and sisters should be encouraged to talk to the boys. So that's one side of it. I think the other side, which in the short term I'm not very hopeful about, is that I would like to see 4chan taken off the clear net. It can go into the dark net. I would like to see much stricter standards on the social media sites but instead under Trump, it's going in the opposite direction. X has become a site for the far right again, or people who are banned for promoting racist material are back. So that worries me that it's going in the wrong direction. I hope that this is a blip. It doesn't look like it, but that the next 3 years and 10 months pass quickly, and we can go back to a system where we can't just have the Wild West in terms of social media. I think there's a very good principle of law that if you shout fire in a crowded cinema and there's no fire, and people get crushed, you're responsible. I think that's what some of the oligarchs who own some of these social media platforms are doing, and I would like to see that more restricted. Maybe that won't happen over the next 3 years, 10 months. After that, we'll see. But certainly at an individual level and collectively, I think people can do much more in terms of challenging the direction that's taken by so many young men.
That was Gavin Evans discussing his book, White Supremacy, A Brief History of Hatred.